Coming up, we'll have Dr. Jamal Rifi talking about the repercussions of this Islamist extremism threat on Australian Muslim communities. Also, a great panel with Samantha Maiden and Miranda Devine. But now we cross to Melbourne to catch up with Cabinet Minister, Industry Minister Josh Frydenberg, who in a former life has advised foreign ministers and former Prime Minister John Howard on security issues. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Nice to be with you.
You're flying out for Paris tonight, as it happens, for meetings in that city unrelated to terrorism. But look, just looking at what's unfolded in Paris, we know about the horror of it. We know, of course, it was a shock and remains a shock to the world. But this sort of large-scale mass terror attack in Europe is hardly unexpected. We've seen plots uncovered and many other attacks thwarted.
Well, you're absolutely right, and a lot of people had been expecting for some time a mass casualty attack like this, and despite every human effort to stop it, it was still carried out. So this is a human tragedy, and our thoughts and our prayers go out to the families of the victims. There are many questions, Chris, that still need to be answered, but first and foremost for your viewers at home, they should not underestimate the significance of the threat that the world faces and that Australia faces, because the numbers are really telling. We have 110 Australians who are currently fighting in Syria and Iraq. That's more foreign fighters from Australia in that region than from Canada or the United States. More than 40 Australians have already been killed in Iraq and Syria, including a number who were suicide bombers. We have over 190 Australians that we know are giving support to those fighters in Syria and Iraq, whether it's financing or recruiting. More than 140 Australian passports have been cancelled, and ASIO and the AFP tell us that they have 400 high priority terrorist investigations currently underway in Australia. So the scale of this threat here at home is enormous, and there needs to be a bipartisan effort at many levels to tackle it.
Well, I'll come back to Australia in a moment, but firstly, back in Europe, we saw the horrible massacre at Charlie Hebdo right at the start of this year, back in January, and I've mentioned some of those other attacks that have been thwarted. Is there any sense at all that there's been complacency in the way European nations have been dealing with the Islamist threat?
I don't think it's time to point that finger, certainly from as far away as Australia, but questions no doubt will be asked by their local authorities as to how these people got into the country and how they got the weapons and the suicide bombing equipment so close to such major public places, including the sports stadium where the French president was at. So I think there will be many questions to be answered, and I have no doubt that the French, the Germans, the Belgians, many other countries in Europe will tighten the security net around their communities to try to prevent such another attack happening.
Look, we have seen an influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees out of the Syria area, out of the Middle East into Europe over the past year. There are early reports that at least one of the attackers in Paris may well have entered Europe as a refugee. That's unconfirmed, of course, but there is an indication of that. Does this not underscore the message that former Prime Minister Tony Abbott delivered in London just last month, saying that for its own security as well as other reasons, Europe had to be much stronger on border patrol, partly because you could allow extremists into your country?
Well, I certainly think Europe needs to be stronger in terms of its border protection, and you've seen those mass loss of lives at sea with people trying to get to Italy and other places in Europe. And, you know, if that's not a reason enough to have stronger border controls, then, you know, these attacks in France and other similar attacks across Europe are another reason to do so. So Australia and its approach has been vindicated because we know that a country that loses control of its borders does invite not only the tragedy of the loss of life at sea, not only the massive cost blowouts and the pain and the suffering that is incurred by long-term detention, but also the direct security threats that are incurred by not knowing exactly the backgrounds of the people that you accept into your own country.
Tony Abbott also in that speech focused on the need to defeat Islamic State militarily, to defeat that threat at its source and to make Syria and northern Iraq safe for people to return. Do you think in the light of what we've seen in Paris that world leaders, especially as they gather at the G20 with Malcolm Turnbull among them, do you think that there will be an appetite that we will see, whether it's under the umbrella of NATO or coalition or God forbid even the UN, we could see a focus on a stronger military effort to defeat Islamic State?
Well, clearly the history of the world shows that failed states are a place for where terrorists can get together, get financed, plan attacks abroad. We saw that with Afghanistan, where the 9/11 attacks, where the Bali attacks, where so many other attacks were related directly or indirectly through the training of Jama'at Islamiyah or Lashkar-e-Toiba or Al-Qaeda back to Afghanistan. Now the same is true in Syria and Iraq. The failure to maintain a cohesive state and the huge fighting that we are seeing there and the mass displacement of peoples is just a human catastrophe, and it will embolden the terrorists. So we do need to deal with this problem at the source, and Malcolm Turnbull was very strong in his comments today about the need to defeat ISIS militarily, as well as to find a political solution in Syria, because, Chris, we can't be defeatist. We were able to defeat Nazism, we were able to defeat totalitarianism, we were able to defeat communism, and we will be able to defeat extreme ideologies, particularly what we are seeing with extreme Islamicism. And that's what we need to take on, and that's a collective effort, Australia and its allies throughout the world.
All right, now just on one other issue, I know it would have taken up a lot more time on any other night, but obviously we needed to focus on this Islamist extremism threat. But I wanted to talk to you about your portfolio area of disposing of nuclear waste. You've come up with 6 sites around Australia. You know the history of this. It's been fraught, it's been emotional, and it hasn't been done. And already from 2 of the sites that have been chosen, one in Queensland and one in South Australia, there has been some negative reaction from the locals. Have a look.
I would hate to find something like that happening in our area.
It's got to be put somewhere, but I really don't think it should be on top of the Murray-Darling Basin.
My biggest fear is the water contamination.
I'm dead against it.
Well, personally, I don't have any objection to it.
See, it is a terrible thing to do to this place.
I suppose those sorts of reactions from residents are not unexpected, Josh Frydenberg, but the difference this time is you've focused on 3 sites in South Australia. I'm coming to you from Adelaide tonight. Of course, you've got one site in three other states, but is it most likely that this nuclear waste centre will be constructed in South Australia, given it was the original state that was chosen some 10 years ago, and given that you have a state Labor government now that is not averse to the idea?
Well, I don't know what the consultation process will deliver, but certainly there seems to be an appetite in South Australia to look seriously at the storage of nuclear waste. And with 3 out of the 6 sites coming from South Australia, I suppose the odds would play to that outcome. But look, we have 6 sites, 1 in Queensland, 1 in Northern Territory, 1 in New South Wales and 3 in South Australia. There will be 120 days worth of consultation with communities, led by my department, also involving ANSTO and Geoscience Australia. We will not be putting this low-level and intermediate waste in a facility that is not accepted or welcomed by the local community. And it has to be understood that Australians are great beneficiaries from nuclear medicine and the work at Lucas Heights. ANSTO delivers 10,000 doses of life-saving medicine every week, which helps people deal with cancers and tumours and arthritis because of that nuclear medicine. So it's absolutely vital. Now, we have an international obligation, Chris, to deal with our own waste. Currently it's stored at around 100 different sites around the country, hospitals and at Lucas Heights itself. World's best practice says find the appropriate single storage facility. That's why we ask for voluntary nominations from landowners. We've now got 6 that are on the short list. Originally we had 28 nominations, and I'm confident that we will find a site at the end of next year.
All right, Josh Frydenberg, you're flying out tonight for Paris to look at some of these energy issues. Not a great time to be flying into Paris. Safe travels.
Thanks very much, Chris. All the best.